So see, this was the most interesting thing for me was the second verification of nature pointing to changes coming. And these are fishermen. Notice that the sea life's behaving differently.
Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum. In the media, overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output, but very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time, cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the Grand Solar Minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David DuByne.
And good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are on this planet. All I can say is climate chaos ensuing across the planet. This was the intensification point that was marked on the Zarkova, Popov, and Shepard charts moving forward in the magnetic fields on the sun canceling, also creating what is going to be considered climate chaos of thousands of years of proportion as at our doorstep as we see right now. There's so many events going on with the heat in the Arctic and the record cold down in South America and the droughts affecting crops everywhere. We're going to try to discuss all of that. Again, the media narrative on full steam ahead to try to keep pushing this thought of everything's warming into oblivion. So as we move forward, I wanted to dissect today's show into several different parts. Also, a quick look over at the crypto market. Seems the rally has stalled and Bitcoin back down. If the crash comes, like a lot of people are saying, because interest rates are pushing up around 3% on the treasury yields back in the U.S., almost every investor out there, every economist says when it reaches over 3, the house of cards comes tumbling down. Perhaps that'll be the catalyst for the next run up in crypto. But anyway, since we spoke last, I took a holiday, went out to the Matzu Islands. This is coastal islands off of China in between Taiwan. It's actually closer to China. But what I went out there to do was for my channel. I have had so many people write in and say, David, where is the safe place going to be on the planet? Can I move somewhere else? Is there a destination that might be safer as all these changes come up? This winter is going to be unbelievably the coldest winter in eons. This Arctic is freezing over. There's still 15-foot thick ice up around Baffin Bay. It's still 9-foot thick up around 80 degrees north latitude. So people always ask me, all right, these changes are coming, crops are going to be lost, it's going to get really, really cold in the winter where some grids will go down. You've heard of the polar vortex. They so quickly don't tell you about the equatorial vortex because it's the same phenomenon based on the magnetosphere weakening, based on changes in our sun. They just want to keep blaming heat on CO2, but they're forgetting the jet streams, the mechanisms that pull that frigid polar air from the Arctic way down to places like Cuba, Algeria, Northern Africa, freezing temperatures, etc., all-time record cold. It's the same mechanism. It's coming up from the equator, drawing extremely warm air up into areas that it's not normally at. The amount of people always asking me, where can I move to with my family? Where can I move to myself, etc.? So I went out to these Matzu Islands. M-A-T-Z-U is the way you spell them. If you're on the internet today, I wanted to do a little bit of interactive as well and take you to some sites. So I head out to these Matzu Islands, M-A-T-Z-U. Again, if you're on the computer, you can check it out. Go to images in your favorite search engine. 60 years ago, when they were getting ready to fight a war with China, Taiwan and China were going to battle to see who could control the islands, who could control, and can they bring one China back in. They were seriously getting ready for a war out there. This is 60 years ago, though. So at the time, the plan was on all of the Matzu Islands was to get everybody ready for at least 6 months with no resupply coming in. So they had a massive plan out there. And this encompassed all the islands. There's 7 bigger islands and a bunch of little tiny ones. On all the major islands, they had set a task for everybody to start growing food together. Everybody. Women, children, army, men, retired. It didn't matter. You had to grow. The fishermen were tasked with something else of setting up different kind of grow, like platforms for different types of seaweed, and they were going into different types of fish to try to do fishing. They built up these stone walls where the fish would come in and they get trapped. So you can, when the tide went out, all these fish were trapped in a pretty large sized tide pool. They would bait it as well. So there was all these solutions they were going to. And then the final thing was they imported an enormous amount of animals to get like the animal husbandry industry started. Mainly they had deer, white-tailed deer, rabbits, chickens, quail, and a few other different kinds of birds. And goats. But they found out quickly that the deers and the goats started stepping on all the landmines. So they cordoned off the animals into just certain parts of the island where they couldn't walk out onto the beaches and step on the landmines, etc. These deers are like bigger rabbits. They started off with 100 on this one island, and then suddenly there were 260. Then there were like 680, and then there were too many, so they had to take them to other smaller islands and leave them. And again, they started with a batch of like 100, and now there's 300-400 of these things naturally on the island, and they've kind of maxed out and stabilized their population based on how much food is there. We went to this one island called Deer Island. Again, little things only like 1 mile across, but maybe a mile, not even a mile and a half wide. It's just like maybe a 3/4 of a mile by a mile wide little island. Got almost 300 deers out there running around. It can be done, and this was the whole point of my story, was self-sufficiency absolutely could be done, and those islands were ready, absolutely, for at least 6 months with no resupply. But you have to remember, everybody worked together. That was the point of the government project, was the entire island cooperated. So fast forward to today, a lot of the old timers from the war are still there. Army's still there. There's an enormous amount of military presence there. But since the war's not happening, the roads go right through the military bases, and the once landmine beaches are free and clear to go swimming on incredibly clear water. But you only see a spackling of little farms and people growing stuff. So at today's rate, there's absolutely 0% chance that they're self-sufficient. They actually import 99% of everything they need every day. Now that includes fuel and plastics and etc., fresh water, kind of filters things. There's not too much water on the island, so they built some dams to try to catch the runoff flow during the typhoon season, but that quickly goes away after a couple months, and they think of different ways on the use seawater with sun dehydrators to create evaporation and pull water that way. They have a whole bunch of tech up there, super low tech, but it allows them to get fresh water out of the sea by just simple evaporation. So back to that, the whole point of the story was people always say, hey, let's get this kumbaya. We can run to an island, and if we can stay safe and grow food and everybody happy. I'll say yes, only if everybody does it together. If there's even 5% or 10% of that island that does not cooperate with you, it's not going to happen, because those 10% of people not doing anything are going to draw on the rest of the resources of people doing something. Now, again, we started asking a lot of in-depth questions, like during this time, how much extra food did you have? And the only extra food that they were able to grow plentifully were different kinds of pumpkins, because the pumpkins really like to grow in sandy soil. So what they said was, everything else that they'd grown, what we consider fresh leafy vegetables, everything from the spinaches, and it was only a certain type of warm weather spinach that could grow only a few months of the year. And then you get into the colder season, and then out on those islands, it gets way down. It gets to freezing temperatures where water actually freezes. So the entire year is not a full grow zone. They get 9 months of grow out there, 9 months of growing season. And it was sort of limited on what crops they could grow as well due to the location and the sandy loam soil. They didn't have any nice, thick, black, decomposed leaf soils that we're used to in many different parts of the world. This was purely a sandy substrate substance kind of stuff. So it limited the amount of types of, edibles that could be grown. That was the whole video. And it was going from island to island to see how much, talk about the past stories, and see if it could be done in the future. And also, we talked to a couple fishermen, and they believe that the cold is coming. And I said, why do you believe that? And then they told me, then I shared my YouTube channel with some different slides in my computer, because I took that with me to do videos on the road and video editing. The science made sense to them, but the sea creatures were the ones alerting them. See, they didn't know about the Grand Solar Minimum as much. What they knew about was the stories of the grandparents, their grandfather, grandmothers, telling them about the cold time. And also, some of these guys were in their 90s that we were talking to. And I do say men, like none of the women really lived to be that old out there. Perhaps it was the really cramped indoor, moist and wet kind of humid conditions. But the oldest people that survived in the older generation out there, they're all the ones that were on the seaside or went out to the sea. They weren't the persons who stayed inside and just did farming around their house or whatnot. These are the people out in more the open all the time. And I found it really strange on what choosing to work in a restaurant or choosing to be a fisherman ended your life 20 years earlier working in a restaurant versus being a fisherman. So we talked to some super old guys, and here's the story they said. There's a certain type of little conch shell, which we ate, by the way, really delicious. In the inside, it has this mother of pearl after you open it up. It has this kind of button on the outside, and you pop it off, and then after you boil them, the muscle comes out. Tasty as can be. They sit inside the palm of your hand. They're not that really big. But he was saying when his grandfather's time, they had to dive deeper to get these kind of little cockles or conchs. And I said, can you explain that to me? And there was a couple of us out there traveling, and we all speak some Chinese. These conch go to deeper water to avoid the colder air temperatures, which is kind of counterintuitive. You think they'd stay closer to the surface to try to get more of the warmth from the warm when it came in the summer or whatnot. But apparently just about 25 or 30 feet down, the temperature stays pretty consistent, at least in this island chain. And these conchs had moved to lower water right now, these last 2 years, as a matter of fact. The thing was, he's like, all right, last year they moved lower, and it was a little bit lower that you could see. It was probably like 5 to 10 foot lower off where they were used to getting them in the coast, because these things grow on the rocks. They're very familiar with how deep things are at low tide, how deep things are at high tide. Because the tide swing out there is crazy. It's like 6 to 9 feet in some of these places, the tide going in and out. And it is startling, the beaches when the tide comes in and it's totally water filled and you see all the rocks. And a lot of stuff gets exposed at that point. So what they do is they go out on the very low tide and they look for these conchs. And there's a lot of different clams and shellfish, etc. on the beaches there. Still a very wild place. You can still get a lot of seafood out of the natural environment. And these guys we talked to also, they said that that itself is diminishing because there's so many tourists coming now doing their own clamming, etc., that they're taking away from the locals. So these types of cockles, I guess is the name for them, they moved last year and the year before about 10 feet deeper in the water. And it was very noticeable that they had to dive deeper and hold their breath longer to go down and snorkel to get these things. This year, he says, they went down to like 30 feet deep. And I said, well, what does that really mean, though? You think, okay, so they descended to about 10 feet in the last 2 years, further in the water column to say further in. Now they're like 30 feet deep. So they moved another at least 10, 15 feet deeper in the water column. And you know what he says? This is what my grandfather talked about. But this guy's like 90 years old telling me his grandfather talked about this same stuff. So it takes us back into right around circa 1900, 1895, 1905, somewhere around that era is what he was talking about. So this matches up pretty well with the centennial cooling that we're seeing across so many records being broken at the moment. So see, this was the most interesting thing for me, was the second verification of nature pointing to changes coming. And these are fishermen. Notice that the sea life's behaving differently based on water temperatures. And you got to realize that this was only at what, like 26, maybe 27 degrees north latitude. Well into, what would be considered tropical Caribbean water type of stuff. If we're talking about United States, Canada, Gulf, Caribbean area, etc. Same latitude. But in the Pacific, it's a little cooler. But what is it with these sea life creatures moving to a little bit deeper water? So we threw out a few ideas. So I tried to explain about UV change in the sun, So they couldn't really peg it on it was UV changes or hot or something that the conchs have gone lower suddenly. But remember, it's coming into winter here as well. So the sea life is already migrating to a different depth of water to get ready for the cooling that's coming, or whatever's going to happen with this winter. These sea creatures are expecting much cooler. And again, you're starting getting reports all around the United States. Now we'll start here first in the U.S., Canada. These black caterpillars are completely black again, and they're furrier than the last year's. The amount of acorns coming down is astounding. They say the tree branches are bending over. There's so many acorns. Nuts, different kind of hazelnuts, walnuts. What else up there? Chestnuts. These things are all in abundant quantities right now. And again, is the earth giving the animals a chance by dropping extra food for them to prepare for the winter? We got the heat up in Norway. News media picking up. And if you notice the news media, they're always focusing on the same one single area. It's almost like, one news organization writes the article, and then everybody else copies it, and that's the only thing out there for the news for the day. Arctic burns and freezes at the same time. This was the whole thing I was talking about. It's just one single article that's been spread amongst every single news outlet. It's always the same article referencing the same place and the same everything, and it's no different. There's like no reporters up there doing anything other than re-referencing the same exact article. So it all talks about up in Norway, and at the very edge of Norway, just before you get into the sea, literally to head up to the Arctic or west to Greenland, every single news headline around the planet is running with this one single story focused on this one single place to prove everything's heating. They're also saying Sweden hasn't been this warm in 250 years. When you go to try to find temperature records to prove daily max or daily min has been broken, those temperature records only go back to like the 1940s. And that's truly from when you go back and look at the Swedish meteorological data centers and their different temperature stations, that's only recorded back to, 70 years ago, 80 years ago officially. But then all these news headlines are saying, oh, it's the warmest in 250 years. But when you compare that with the sunspot activity, 250 years takes us right back to the end of the Dalton minimum. So just do the math. 2018, 1776. So if they're looking at a pattern of at least 250 years on the heating, it shows that it's a returning cycle. Because if it was that hot 250 years ago, all these claims of it's the warmest year ever and it's the hottest ever don't stand, because it was at least that hot 250 years ago. And this is what they're claiming in the articles. So they just prove that it's cyclic because it was that hot 250 years ago and now it's hot again. So I want to do a little mind experiment with you here. If it's a 250-year cycle and they're proving it with the heat, we can also come over and go with the cold. And what happened? What were the lithographs? What were the paintings about George Washington crossing the rivers with cannons of ice cover? 1774, 73. That's just barely a couple years off of what they're talking about with this return heat cycle. Begs the question, what type of icy conditions are going to pervade the eastern United States this year due to, even if we're just looking again at that 250-year cycle like the Swedish heat article claims, 70 degrees north latitude, new record high temperature. But see, that's only one single location. Because when we look at other things such as, I don't know, I'll take you over to icegenow.info to take a look at record cold in Russia. Head east from the exact same spot. Other temperature stations in that same area of Russia. Remember, you're just going directly east of supposedly this whole hot thing in the Arctic. Just head straight east and you come into these same areas in Siberia. Daily air temperatures, multi-year lows. Breaking that from 1919. Again, we come back to that centennial low type of thing, which is also verified in the Pacific by the fishermen, talking about when their grandparents had the conchs move to deeper water as well. So now we got these different instances of these at least the centennial minimum coming up. So 1919 is pretty much 100 years from 2018. So when the Russian media is picking up and talking about record cold temperatures, early snow, below normal temperatures across western Siberia, And it's making their front page news on their newspapers across the country. Apparently, there's no global warming in Tobolsk and all these other areas. But why did the media not compare this? Where's the counterbalance on all the cold that's happening over in Russia that's way below normal temperatures? That makes no sense for everybody living there saying, this makes no sense why it's so cold. But you think there'd be a little more balanced coverage in the news. If you're breaking temperature records to the cold side, less than 1,000 miles east of where you broke our temperature record on the hot side, in the same area of the same continent, so you think they should put those together? And maybe you can inform me of why you think they wouldn't talk about both of the issues and both of these events happening.